What is a virtual machine? It what? Hello and welcome back. Today we want to talk about virtual machines. More appropriately, we want to talk about virtual machines on a NAS. In today's video, we're going to talk about what a virtual machine is. We're going to talk about some of the more popular variants of third-party virtual machine software and where does NAS fit into this equation. Because in the last few years, we have really seen the NAS brands, particularly Synology and QNAP, make this big move to associate themselves with big virtual machine platforms such as VMware, the likes of Hyper-V, and that big blob storage we're seeing online, and also the connectivity between some of those third-party services that are trying to get into SaaS, or software as a service. We're seeing the likes of Google Workspace, or what used to be formerly G Suite, and the likes of Office 365, trying to get business users to move their assets as much as possible over to these cloud services. And NAS brands may be feeling a tad threatened by this, or just trying to make it abundantly clear that their solutions can exist in conjunction with it, have resulted in this whole big splurge on marketing and splurge on research and development into virtual machine implementation and NAS. Now, virtual machines, for those that aren't aware, let's keep this as chewable and easy as possible throughout this video. A virtual machine is a virtual equivalent of a computer environment. There's actually a great deal more to it than that. First and foremost, it's worth highlighting that a virtual machine isn't necessarily like a Windows computer. It's not, any old copy of Windows XP. A virtual machine is a very broad term. It is a virtual version of that, a virtual version of a computer that isn't strictly OS dependent. More than likely you'll need an OS to run on it, but unlike a standard monitor, keyboard, mouse, computer interface that's got an SSD or something inside, that's got your operating system and your files and maybe a graphics card, what this is kind of a virtual image of that, and you can have multiple of these images living on a NAS system, and then that single NAS system or blob online service provider can allow you to have multiple VMs that can be accessed remotely or via the network in the case of a NAS, and have all of these PCs, because you still need an interface to work with to access that virtual machine, but it is living elsewhere and therefore kind of more being streamed than it is being more locally accessed. That is a virtual machine, and that is the way it's been for a number of years. But why do people use virtual machines? Because let's face it, as I mentioned, most virtual machines of any shape or form typically still require a KVM, keyboard video mouse setup, or at least an online, a physical representation to interact with. So why on earth would anyone who owns a physical computer or a phone or a tablet or anything actually want to use some faraway version, some virtual version of that, when it just seems so counterintuitive? Well, first and foremost, a virtual machine does allow you to install multiple OSs. So say, for example, you are running a Windows environment, but you want to take advantage of some Mac-based software. You can install a Mac-based VM on things like VirtualBox using something called Hackintosh, which is on the cusp of legal, I guess. Will allow a Windows user to take advantage and utilize a Mac environment from within Windows. It is genuinely a window that can be opened up within Windows, and within there you can access the Mac OS. And again, that works in reverse as well. You can be on a Mac system or a Linux system or an Android system and still have access to, by opening a window, a full OS of Windows or one of the others. And a number of users like to test out other OSs, and particularly some of those lesser known OSs, in this fashion. Another big advantage of taking advantage of virtual machine environment, and this is more internally. This is if you want to take advantage of like beta applications or testing unstable versions of apps, and say there is some sort of alpha or beta or beta. There you go, for use out there, the pronunciation nerds. If you want to take advantage of some of these apps, a lot of the time you're ever so slightly worried that using it on your core internal system may be problematic or threatening, or may open you up to security vulnerabilities. So taking advantage of a virtual machine that's either a clone of your existing setup or just a completely independent VM will allow you to test out these betas without it impacting your system or opening you up to your data being connected to an unstable program. Another reason that a number of people will want to use a virtual machine, either in conjunction with their existing system or as an alternative, is because virtual machines allow you to take advantage of older OSs and older versions of your OS, but then use those old programs. One of the classic examples that we see time and time again is the lack of common support these days of things like Windows XP and Windows 7. Those two platforms, there's still a lot of programs out there that are deemed legacy or old that people still want to use, or at least open up old archives they have in that environment. In order to do that, you can use a virtual machine that you open up within your existing OS or port it onto a NAS, and then from there you can open it up and then use that old OS to access all of that old data. Now, those are the three main reasons that a home user or a prosumer may wish to use a VM. But let's be completely upfront. VMs are almost predominantly business and enterprise led. And the reason that VMs are utilized in those environments are for reasons of security, reasons of access, and often reasons of affordability. Because rather than having lots and lots of PCs that have got their own core storage and you have to go to the trouble of migrating and synchronizing data and making sure those backups are as rigid as possible, a business that wants to use a large bare metal server, and we'll get onto the subject of bare metal in a moment, but a large storage server or a large cloud space or a large NAS, a big old rack mount or something, the reason you want to do that with multiple VMs is that means your clients, your employees, your off-site workers are able to have an equivalent of their desktop system that doesn't actually live locally. The majority of that system, and again, not the keyboard, video, mouse and such, are living over there on that server and allowing them to have recovery. If there's a problem, they can roll it back. They can also clone that VM very, very quickly to make sure that there's synchronicity amongst all of the desktop systems in their environment. They've also then got access to all the files that are created within that network, and a greater degree of control and monitoring is open with multiple VMs as opposed to multiple standalone systems that are connected to a centralized storage server. So those are kind of the main reasons that people utilize VMs in 2021, 2022, no doubt. But a lot of you are already using them. You may not be using a NAS for your virtual machines, but I'm willing to bet one of the three programs I'm about to mention, if you are a VM user, it's going to fall into that category. Now, these are not operating systems. It's important that you realize that these are tools. These are known as hypervisors. Hypervisors come in multiple forms, but a hypervisor is a program that stores and holds the VMs on a software level. And these three pieces of software, technically all hypervisors of different variants and utilities, are almost certainly the hypervisor that you're going to be using on your bare metal server or somewhere out there on the cloud, which is technically somewhere on bare metal. So the first one, let's get it straight out of the way, VMware. Whether you're using ISXi or you are utilizing vSphere, these are all components of vSphere. VMware is by far the most successfully implemented hypervisor in the industry. There are others out there, and certainly the next one we're going to talk about, Hyper-V, has a lot going for it. But VMware is kind of the big one, and pretty much everyone supports it or everyone wants to support it. It is their own hypervisor there that allows you to install multiple VMs within that hypervisor for your business use. It's got backups, it's got snapshots, it's got everything. It's also massively compatible with all of that online cloud storage that I've mentioned, and NASs as well, with NAS, all of the NAS brands trying to make sure they are as supportive of VMware as they possibly can. It's established itself as the longest running contender of VMware in the enterprise market, and even SMB, small medium business users, implement it in a large way. One of the biggest appeals of it is it has much wider OS support than its biggest contender, which is Hyper-V from Microsoft. On top of that, it can be installed both as a bare metal hypervisor and as a hypervisor living on top of another OS, and we'll get onto that again in just a moment. Now, I mentioned Hyper-V there. Hyper-V is kind of the Microsoft targeted variant. If you look at VMware as a more open platform, Hyper-V is a far more Microsoft targeted platform, although it does support a few other OSs within. Predominantly, it is something that's utilized with Microsoft Server, and also Hyper-V does integrate into home desktop services as well for cloning your desktop OS and more. Now, Hyper-V, because of its large and dedicated focus on Microsoft systems, as more and more businesses are open to the idea of other OSs within Linux, or you've got lots of mixed storage environments, mixed OS environments in businesses where you've got a combination of administrative and creative, the result is Hyper-V has lost a lot of market share back to VMware, which is already largely domineering the market because of its open nature. But we can't talk about open nature hypervisor software without talking about one of the longest running freewares out there. And by freeware, I do mean open source. I'm of course talking about VirtualBox. VirtualBox is kind of most people's entry point, at least at the home level, into VMware. It's some software that you can install in pretty much any OS. It's normally the one a lot of Mac users use for the first time as well when they want to utilize a Windows-based program in their Mac environment. VirtualBox is an open source virtual machine hypervisor software that you install within your OS, and then from there you can create those virtual environments. It supports way more OSs than anyone else, and also a number of NAS brands like Acer have implemented VirtualBox onto their systems. Synology and QNAP haven't, because they have their very own hypervisor software that I'm going to touch on in just a moment. But those are your three. At the top of the range here, VMware. Then you've got your Hyper-V, which is still an aged and well-established figure in the world of hypervisor and VMware implementation, but still nonetheless has lost some ground to VMware in recent times and its multifaceted, multi-natured structure that they have internally. And of course, VirtualBox being the free option there at the end. So, when you are using these three services, it should be mentioned that VMs can be deployed in two key ways: bare metal and standard hypervisor living on top of a OS. Now, this is where things can get awfully complex, and it is very dependent, one, on the OSs you're running, and two, your skill set. VMware is something that is available in this fashion, where bare metal is when you have your storage server, and again, that can be the NAS that you have or something far away. A bare metal enclosure is when you've got the bare metal, and then on top of that, you've got your hypervisor software, no OS at all, and then on top of that, you've got your VMs that live there. Performance is higher, configuration is higher, security is higher as well, because there isn't any openings or vulnerabilities that an OS may be open to. But unfortunately, bare metal is something that is incredibly hard to deploy locally. Bare metal, more and more, is something that we're seeing within businesses. Only the high-end enterprise that have enormous storage servers and SAN-based environments to take advantage of. That's why a lot of other people will take advantage of that hypervisor that lives on top of the storage server OS. Now, if you are going to take advantage of bare metal that removes the OS layer there in the midst of all of the VM deployment, that is when those cloud services, again, we are talking about those SaaS services, how they advertise their blob storages. They go, right, we will give you the bare metal, you just throw your VMware at us, we'll take care of the rest. And it's one of the biggest appealing points of those services, and by nowhere near as straightforward as that, but it's certainly pretty close indeed. And when you're trying to deploy this kind of stuff locally, it can get incredibly intimidating along the way. Which brings us to where NAS fits in this. And again, I'm going to talk predominantly about Synology and QNAP here. It's very, very important that we talk about, one, their own software, and two, why it's not technically exclusive against using VMware, Hyper-V, or the rest of it. So both Synology and QNAP have their own virtual machine software. Synology have Synology's Virtual Machine Manager, and QNAP have Virtualization Station. Now, for those of you that have followed this channel in the past, you'll know that between the two of them, standalone within a NAS environment, I believe Virtualization Station is the better of the two. And I will say why, but bear in mind, I say it's the better of the two if you're only going to use the NAS for your VMs. The minute you are going to integrate software as a service and some of these VMware established or in other locations in conjunction with the NAS, then the better, which is the better platform, changes very, very quickly, and there's actually a lot of arguments for and against. So, firstly, let's talk about Synology's Virtual Machine Manager. Virtual Machine Manager from Synology has evolved dramatically in the last 2 years. It was always there, and it was a good tool, but it was massively overshadowed by QNAP's platform, which is a great deal more open and was a lot more user-friendly, which is something I never thought I'd really say about a QNAP system. But in the last couple of years, Synology's Virtual Machine Manager has integrated wildly with the likes of VMware, Hyper-V, creating clusters within the system that could take advantage of high availability. And on top of that, integration with their backup tool, Active Backup Suite, and Active Backup Suite for Office 365 and Google Workspace has resulted in a system where you can not only host VMs within your Synology NAS, but you can also integrate and run parallel with, for backup, snapshots, recovery, and more, with those VMwares, those OSs and VMs that live on those cloud storage based blobs that we've talked about. And if in the event that your business setup suffers internet outages, or the VM becomes inaccessible for any other reason, the Synology NAS will be able to switch over to its own virtual machine tools and host the VMs if it's got enough hardware under the bonnet. And of course, it will advise for that. Now, that's a big integration of NAS and those cloud-based SaaS services. Having them running simultaneously, as well as the ability to integrate with and run parallel with Google Workspace and Office 365, results in a setup where the bare metal of the NAS runs parallel to the VMs running on a cloud space or another hardware living far away. And because they're synchronized together, and because synchronized may not be the right word, because they're backed up together and they are identical data that's running through one onto the other, if you lose contact with one, you've still got access to the Synology NAS and that archive that can be restored in Synology Virtual Machine Manager, or at least for the interim, to reduce downtime for your connected business users or clients. Now, QNAP sort of has this, it has to be said. QNAP has it, but it's nowhere near as intuitive as Synology's, and they definitely don't shout as loud about it because their systems switch over to cloud is by no means as intuitive or as snappy as the Synology equivalent there. Now, QNAP's Virtualization Station, the reason I always talk a big game about it, and when I've done videos about it here on the channel, is because of the following. One, it is by far the most configurable VM tool out there as hypervisors go. And yes, it is a hypervisor that's living on top of the QNAP's own OS, which lives on top of the hardware. So again, that's got that layer there. Both of them have it. The Virtualization Station platform, one, integrates with cloud services just the same way as the Synology does in terms of backups and restoration and snapshots, thanks to Hyperdata Protector. But on top of that, it also has BoxSafe, which is separate to it for synchronization with G Suite and Google Workspace, which makes it a little bit more finicky. There's a few extra apps to play with Synology, kind of homing it into those two apps there. On top of that, the Virtualization Station platform from QNAP has certain configuration options that prioritize it as a standalone VM system. For a start, you can install PCIe cards inside the QNAP NAS that can be used by the virtual machine. Definitely graphics cards, but other cards as well. You can obviously integrate the USB ports. Both platforms allow that. But QNAP also supports KVM setups, keyboard, video, mouse, whereby your QNAP NAS can be a standalone PC which is also operating as a NAS in the background, of course, but also when you're far away or when you're remote, you've still got access to the VM. It is a far more multifaceted means to access your VM. On top of that, you've also got dedicated download tools there as well. Within Virtualization Station, that not only allow you to install a myriad of third-party VM environments like OS Router and a pfSense within the VM Marketplace and Zabbix as well, for network and router-based OSs for your environment. But then you've got a Microsoft virtual machine download area where you can download VMs for XP, 7, 8, 10, and Windows Server directly within 2 to 3 clicks onto the QNAP NAS and test out those VMs. Same goes if you want to take advantage of Linux or Ubuntu, to be more precise. QNAP has its own dedicated Ubuntu VM installation tool that allows you to install versions 18, 19 and 20 of Ubuntu and deploy them within about 3 clicks. All of the things I've described are fast and allow the QNAP Virtualization Station application to really allow a centralized VM within the NAS to be really impressive. And for those that have just arrived on VMs and want to kind of find their ground, work out what they want from a VM, the QNAP platform is going to be incredibly appealing. Synology doesn't allow 1 or 2 click VM installs. It relies on you to bring the media to the party, the image media, but still nonetheless, its integration with Hyper-V and VMware has managed to surpass QNAP's quite quickly in the last couple of years. And you can tell that Synology have really focused on this as their main advertising tool for it. Though I will highlight that Synology's Virtual Machine Manager also has a pro version that's subscription based, which if you're looking at being an enterprise user and take advantage of the bare metal inside, as well as integrate larger batches of VMs, you may have to move towards the pro medium, particularly if you're looking at some of the background snapshots or looking at some of that high availability as well. Some of those features are either limited or completely unavailable in the free version of Synology's virtual machine platform. So virtual machine deployment and implementation on a NAS is quite diverse, and both brands bring a lot of different things to the party. I've not even talked about containers, that's for another video. But let's talk about what are the recommended hardware values that you need on your NAS in order to take advantage of this, because technically you can run a VM on something as modest as a dual-core Celeron and a couple of gig of memory. You know, Synology even allow you to install their virtual machine tool, which again is quite an aggressive tool, on those systems. But to be perfectly honest, the VMs that are going to run on that, bearing in mind that a virtual machine, either partially with intelligent resource management or fully, will occupy whatever resources you give it. So, case in point, on a dual-core NAS with 2 gig of memory, if you make a VM, a very light VM, like an XP VM, which is even then quite a lot, or some kind of light Linux or even an Android VM, and you go, right, I'm going to dedicate 1 core and 1 gig of memory, even with memory sharing enabled, which again, you do need a decent enough system to do that, and 1 core in operation, the minute you run that VM, you halve the system available resources to run the NAS. And if the NAS starts chugging along badly, so will the VM anyway. So in terms of minimum requirements, I'd certainly say a quad-core CPU. I'd go minimum Pentium, but definitely a Xeon, because although you can run VMs on some of these modest Celeron systems, you really will get a poor experience out of it if you're going to use it for business. So at least a quad-core i3 or maybe a Xeon, I would say. In terms of memory, minimum 8. People say you can get away with 4 gig, and certainly you can run a VM on 4 gig, but you're not going to have an exceptionally good time, and you're only going to be able to run very modest VMs overall. In terms of storage, that's hard to say because different VMs have certain requirements, and particularly if you're going to be using a VM for business, and if you're going to be running multiple VMs on like a powerful high-end rack server that runs in unison with Hyper-V or VMware, and it's a bare metal fallback that's storing images, storing snapshots and data, but also working as a failover if your VMware online is inaccessible and you need a locally accessed virtual machine alternative, then certainly you're going to need a decent amount of space for the retention of the snapshots and images long term, and when you start cloning those VMs for multiple users. But this has been virtual machines and NAS before you buy. It's an incredibly tough subject to put into this video, and again, this has been skimming a stone over the ocean. It's been very, very light on details because this is an incredibly complex subject. If you are interested in learning more, let me know in the comments. I would love to do a dedicated VMware video, but again, such a big video to cover all of its multifaceted environment and installation on a NAS that I need to know you guys want that. So click like if you've enjoyed the video, click subscribe if you want to learn more. And if you are interested in getting the right NAS for your storage needs, do visit the free advice section at NAS Compares below. It's manned by myself and Eddie, the web guy. It is not done for a profit. It is not charged. It's completely free. So before you start spending hundreds or thousands of pounds on an expert for advice, use the free advice section. You may well be surprised. It's manned by two humans. There is no automation to it really, so it may take us an extra day or two to answer your queries. Take advantage, unbiased, free advice. What you got to lose? I will see you next time.